Part 3. Eric, Matt, and Stewie moved quickly through the outskirts of Pripyat, keeping low and avoiding any open areas. The city had already proven itself to be more than just an abandoned ruin. Something else lurked within its depths, something beyond their understanding. They weren't about to take any more chances. As they reached the exclusion zone's perimeter, they spotted the familiar rusted fence that marked their entry point. It was still intact, just as they had left it. Climbing over would be the easy part. The real challenge was ensuring they weren't seen. Matt checked his watch. If we time this right, we should be able to slip through without any patrols catching us. Stewie exhaled sharply. Let's just get this over with. One by one, they climbed over the fence, carefully dropping onto the other side. For the first time in days, they were technically outside of the forbidden zone. Yet, none of them felt relieved. They stuck to the tree line, moving deeper into the forest that stretched beyond Pripyat. They had stashed extra supplies a few miles from the city, just in case they needed them for the journey back. The plan had always been to hike to a rendezvous point where a contact would drive them back to Kiev. As they walked, the eerie silence of the forest pressed in around them. Even the birds seemed hesitant to make noise. After what felt like hours, they reached the small hidden cache they had left behind before entering the zone. Bottled water, some protein bars, and a change of clothes to make them look less like trespassers. Eric pulled out a map and double-checked their route. We stick to this road for a few miles, then wait at the old bus stop. Our ride should be there by nightfall. They moved as quickly as they could, the weight of exhaustion pressing down on them. Every rustling branch or snapping twig sent a jolt of paranoia through their bodies, but they never saw anything. Finally, as the last light of day began to fade, they spotted the rundown bus stop, a small concrete structure covered in faded Soviet murals. The road beside it was cracked and overgrown, a relic of a time long past. Matt sat down on the cold concrete bench. We actually made it. Stewie, leaning against the wall, let out a nervous chuckle. Yeah, I guess we did. Eric stayed standing, staring back toward the direction they had come. The skyline of Pripyat was no longer visible, but the feeling of being watched hadn't faded. Something had been in that city with them. Something had followed them. And though they had left Pripyat behind, he wasn't sure if Pripyat had left them. The distant hum of an approaching vehicle cut through the silence. Their ride was almost here. It was time to go home. The black SUV rolled to a slow stop in front of the bus stop. The driver, a middle-aged Ukrainian man with a cigarette hanging from his lips, lowered the window just enough to get a look at them. You the guys? He asked in a thick accent. Eric nodded. Yeah. The man gave them a long look, as if sizing them up. You look like hell, he muttered before unlocking the doors. They wasted no time getting inside. The seats were worn, but to them, they felt like pure luxury compared to the cold concrete and rusted ruins they had called home for the past few days. As the SUV pulled away from the abandoned road, Matt exhaled. I can't believe we actually did it. Stewie laughed, rubbing his face. I can't believe we're still alive. Eric, however, stayed quiet. He watched the darkening forest pass by outside, his mind still trapped in Pripyat. The encounters, the shadows, the strange figures. They had left the city, but something deep inside him told him that the city wasn't done with them yet. The driver glanced at them in the rearview mirror. Tourists, huh? He smirked. You got your little adventure? More than we wanted, Matt muttered. The driver snorted. You're lucky. Many don't come back. The weight of his words settled over them. They had seen things in that city that no one would believe. And yet, as they sat in the SUV, speeding farther and farther away from the zone, they realized that the hardest part was still ahead of them, returning to normal life. Would things ever feel normal again? Eric wasn't sure, but one thing was clear. Pripyat had changed them. The drive back to Kiev was long, but in a way, it felt like a dream. The landscape around them began to change, slowly but surely, from the decaying remnants of the exclusion zone to the more familiar, cultivated fields of Ukraine. The sun had set completely now, casting long shadows across the land. Stewie leaned his head back against the seat, eyes closed, and sighed. I can't believe we're really leaving it behind. You think that's it? Matt asked, raising an eyebrow. You think we just walk away from all that and it's over? Stewie didn't answer right away. Eric, who had been silently staring out the window, turned to them both. What do you mean? Matt ran a hand through his hair. I don't know. I feel like we're not the same anymore. Like that place, it's still with us. Eric nodded. He had the same feeling, the one that gnawed at the edges of his thoughts, making his stomach twist. It was as if something in that place had marked them. But what? And why? The car moved steadily, the rumbling of the tires on the road almost lulling them to sleep. But the quiet in the vehicle felt unnatural after everything that had happened in Pripyat. There were so many questions, so many memories. The strange creatures, the eerie silence of the deserted city, the chilling moments when they felt like they were being watched. Every little detail lingered in Eric's mind. He couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't really done with Pripyat yet. You guys ever wonder what's still in there? Eric finally asked, his voice quiet. Stewie looked at him. What do you mean? Like, what if there's still something waiting for us? Matt smirked, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. You mean like ghosts? You think there's something left in that place? After everything's been abandoned for so long? I don't know, Eric muttered. Ed, but I keep thinking about those creatures, the figures we saw, the way everything felt so off. What if we weren't the only ones who noticed? Stewie shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Man, don't say that. I don't want to think about it. The driver, who had been silent up until this point, suddenly spoke. It's not ghosts you should be worried about. Eric turned to him, startled. What do you mean? The man's eyes darted briefly in the rearview mirror. Some things never leave that place. Some things live on. A heavy silence fell over the car as the words hung in the air. Eric felt the temperature in the vehicle drop a few degrees. You can't go back, the driver added quietly. You don't go into that city without paying a price. And even if you leave, it doesn't always let you go. Eric's heart began to race. He exchanged a glance with Matt and Stewie. The driver smirked slightly. But hey, what do I know? I'm just a guy driving a car. They didn't speak again until they reached the outskirts of Kiev. The feeling of unease lingered, but the city's lights were a welcome sight. It was the first real glimpse of normal life they had seen in days. Yet, even as they left the eerie silence of Pripyat behind them, the question remained. Would they ever truly leave it? The city of Kiev seemed to breathe in contrast to the stillness of the Chernobyl exclusion zone. It was busy, alive with people, cars, and the rush of urban life, a stark difference to the empty silence they had left behind. But as Eric, Matt, and Stewie settled back into their hotel, a strange feeling gnawed at them, a sense of disconnection. Their bodies were back in the city, but their minds were still tangled in the twisted labyrinths of Pripyat. They sat around a small table in the hotel room, surrounded by empty cans of beer, each of them lost in their own thoughts. I thought I'd feel better once we left, Matt said, breaking the silence. He threw his can into the trash and stood up, pacing around the room. But it's like, I don't know. Like there's still something unfinished. Yeah, Stewie replied. It doesn't feel like we've fully left it behind. That city. Something was wrong there, man. I keep thinking about the faces we saw, and that thing in the forest. Eric was silent for a moment before speaking. It wasn't just the place. It was us too. We changed in there. We saw things we weren't supposed to see. We felt things that didn't make sense. Then why does it feel like we're still being watched? Matt asked, pausing to look out the window at the darkening skyline. Stewie shuddered. Stop. I don't want to hear that right now. I'm just trying to get back to normal. But Eric couldn't shake the feeling. No matter how many times he tried to tell himself it was just exhaustion, just the adrenaline of surviving something dangerous, deep down, he knew something else was at play. The next morning, they found themselves walking through the streets of Kiev. They were going through the motions, buying coffee, checking in on their phones, trying to shake the memories of Pripyat. But nothing felt the same. They saw the city through different eyes now. The usual hustle and bustle seemed distant, like a world that no longer fully belonged to them. The city felt too loud, too fast. They walked in silence, their footsteps echoing strangely as they moved through the crowd. I think we need to talk about what happens next, Eric finally said, breaking the silence. You mean, what happens when we get home? Stewie asked. Eric nodded. Yeah, this experience, it's going to change everything. We can't just go back to our regular lives after all of this. Matt chuckled dryly. Speak for yourself. I'm getting back to normal. I'm not going to let this whole thing ruin me. But Stewie wasn't so sure. You think you can just forget about it? You think we can just move on like it never happened? I don't know, Matt said quietly, his tone more serious than usual. I'm just saying we can't let it control us. We went there. We saw things. But we're still here. That has to count for something. They stopped in front of a cafe and ordered more coffee, still processing the events that had unfolded. But even in the relative safety of the cafe, the doubts lingered. There was something about Pripyat, something about that place, that they could never truly leave behind. The fear, the unease, the sense that they had uncovered something too powerful to ignore. None of it was gone. And no matter how much they tried to push it aside, it would follow them, like a shadow in their minds, lurking just beneath the surface. They weren't sure what to do with all the impressions they had gathered, how to process the bizarre experiences and the eerie creatures they had encountered. And no matter how much they wanted to pretend they could go back to normal, the truth was that something inside them had changed. The world would never look the same again. But for now, they were alive, and maybe, just maybe, that was all they could hold on to. Weeks passed since they had left Pripyat. The normalcy of everyday life seemed to slowly creep back in, like a fog lifting. Eric, Matt, and Stewie tried to focus on their jobs, their relationships, their routine, but the remnants of their experiences haunted them. It was a quiet evening when Eric sat down to look through his camera. He had taken dozens of photos during their trip, trying to document everything they encountered. But as he flipped through the images, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. There was a picture of an abandoned building in Pripyat, the once bustling city frozen in time. The windows were broken, the walls covered in peeling paint, yet the image looked so ordinary. And yet, when Eric stared at it longer, he felt an unease he couldn't explain. Matt, sitting across from him in the dim light of the apartment, noticed the tension in Eric's face. "What's up?" Eric shook his head. "It's nothing. Just looking at these photos, I don't know. Something feels off." "Yeah," Matt muttered, rubbing his temple. "I know what you mean. It's like we're stuck with this. Stuck with the memories, the sounds, the weird things we saw." Stewie, who had been quiet, looked at his two friends, his face drawn with worry. "We're all trying to forget, but we can't. It's not that easy." Eric exhaled slowly, closing the photo album. "You know, I've been thinking maybe it's time we face it. Maybe it's time we tell someone what happened." Matt immediately tensed. "Tell someone? Are you crazy? Do you think anyone would believe us?" "I'm not talking about telling everyone," Eric replied, "but maybe we need to talk to someone who understands, someone who's not going to dismiss us as crazy." Stewie looked between them, considering the idea. "Maybe. But who do we talk to? Who's going to get it? You heard what people say about Chernobyl. People think we're lucky to be alive, but they don't really understand what we went through." "I know," Eric said quietly, "but we can't just keep pretending it didn't happen. We need to figure out what it was, what we saw, and most importantly, why." The conversation fell into silence. It felt like they were stuck in limbo, unsure of how to move forward. What had they really uncovered in Pripyat? And what were they supposed to do with the experiences that were now a part of them? Matt looked at Eric, his expression dark. What if the answers are better left unknown? What if some things shouldn't be figured out? Eric met Matt's gaze. "I don't know, but I feel like if we don't do something, it'll keep following us. We'll never really be able to move on." Stewie sighed. "All right, let's say we do try to figure it out. What happens then? Will it change anything? Will we just go back to our regular lives, or will we keep digging until we're in deeper than we can handle?" "I don't know," Eric admitted, "but I don't think we can keep running from it. Not forever." The weight of their decisions pressed down on them. They didn't have answers, only questions. The past few months had been nothing short of surreal, and the events they experienced felt like something out of a nightmare. But somehow, they couldn't escape the feeling that it was all connected to something bigger, something beyond their understanding. As the night stretched on, they sat in the quiet of the room, contemplating their next move. The world outside felt distant, almost unreal. They were living in a strange in-between, suspended between two realities. the one they left behind and the one they now faced. For the first time, they wondered if returning to Pripyat might be the only way to truly find the answers they needed, or if doing so would plunge them even deeper into the mystery they had already barely survived. One thing was certain: the adventure they'd embarked on wasn't over. It had only just begun. The days following their conversation were filled with uncertainty. Eric, Matt, and Stewie couldn't stop thinking about Pripyat and the haunting experiences that followed them. The unease they felt was more than just the shadow of an adventure gone wrong. It was a sense of something unfinished, a thread that they couldn't let go. It was late one night when Eric made the decision. He stood in the dim light of his apartment, staring at the maps they had used on their journey, the abandoned areas of Pripyat, the structures they hadn't explored, the places that seemed to hold the answers. The question gnawed at him. What if they had missed something? "Matt, Stewie," he said, his voice steady, but carrying the weight of determination. "We need to go back. We missed something, and I can't shake the feeling that the answers are still out there." Matt, sitting on the couch, looked up with a frown. "We've been over this. We can't keep going back. It was dangerous enough the first time." "I know," Eric said, pacing slowly, "but I can't stop thinking about it. What if there's more? What if we didn't see everything? I know we promised ourselves we'd never go back, but I don't think we can live with the doubt." Stewie, who had been silent until now, finally spoke. "You're right. Something still doesn't sit right with me. Maybe it's because we didn't finish it, didn't get the answers we need." Eric turned to him, a small sense of relief washing over him. "Exactly. We need to know what we were up against, and we need to be sure it's really over. This feeling, it won't go away until we do something about it." After a long silence, Matt exhaled and rubbed his face, clearly exhausted. "All right, fine, I'll go. But if this ends badly, I'm blaming you." Stewie gave a short laugh, clearly nervous but resolved. "I guess we're all in this together, huh?" The decision was made. A week later, the trio found themselves back at the borders of the exclusion zone. The cold wind cut through their jackets as they stood near the old checkpoint. The landscape had not changed much since their last visit. The same eerie quiet hung in the air, broken only by the occasional rustle of wind through the overgrown vegetation. Matt was looking at the watch on his wrist, frowning. "I still don't know about this. We promised ourselves we wouldn't come back." "I know," Eric replied, "but we have to. We'll be in and out. Just a quick scan. We won't stay long." Stewie, now fully geared up for the expedition, stared at the crumbling city in the distance. "We might find what we're looking for, or we might get in deeper than we can handle." Eric gave him a determined nod. "We can handle it. We have to." Together, they started their journey toward the heart of the city, moving quickly through the overgrown streets of Pripyat. As they passed the abandoned buildings, the air felt thicker, more oppressive. It was as if the city itself was holding its breath, waiting for them to make the next move. They passed by the Ferris wheel, the iconic symbol of the city's abandonment, and Eric paused for a moment. "Remember when we first saw this? We had no idea what we were about to get into." Stewie grinned weakly. "Yeah, it was just an adventure then. Now it feels different." Matt, always the practical one, checked the map again. "We should head for the north side. There are some places we missed last time. Maybe something there will give us a clue." The hours stretched on as they ventured deeper into the heart of Pripyat. The buildings around them seemed even more unsettling in the daylight, their once proud facades now decaying and covered in vines. The air was thick with dust, and the city was still, as if it had been waiting for them. After several hours of exploring, they arrived at a forgotten complex, hidden behind a line of trees. This building was unlike any they had explored before. It was sealed off, its windows dark, and there was an overwhelming sense of unease as they stepped closer. "I don't like this," Matt muttered, eyeing the structure warily. "We're almost there," Eric said, taking a deep breath. "Let's see what's inside." They carefully made their way inside, the door creaking loudly as they pushed it open. Inside, the air was stale, and the smell of old decay lingered. The walls were lined with old, rusting equipment, and the flickering light of their torches revealed a mess of broken machinery. It was clear no one had been here for a long time. Suddenly, Eric's light landed on something that made his stomach drop. a set of strange markings on the floor. Symbols, unfamiliar and unsettling. They seemed to pulse with a strange energy, almost as if they were alive. "We've seen these before," Stewie said quietly, his voice filled with awe. Eric nodded, his heart pounding. "Yeah, these are the same symbols we saw in the other building, the ones we couldn't understand." Matt shook his head. "You're telling me those symbols are all over this place? What does that mean?" Before Eric could answer, there was a soft, low sound from somewhere in the distance, something barely perceptible, like a hum vibrating through the air. It was a sound they had heard before. "Not again," Matt muttered, his voice tight with fear. Eric held up a hand, signaling for them to stay quiet. The hum grew louder. Something was out there. Something was watching them. The hunt for answers had led them here, and now they would finally discover whether they were ready to face whatever had been lurking in Pripyat all along. The low hum that filled the air sent a shiver down Eric's spine. It was deep, almost imperceptible, yet undeniably there. The three of them exchanged uneasy glances, their flashlights casting trembling beams of light across the dust-covered walls. "Tell me that's just the wind," Stewie whispered, gripping his flashlight tighter. "It's not the wind," Matt replied, his voice barely above a breath. Eric took a cautious step forward, his eyes locked on the strange symbols on the floor. They looked old, much older than the Soviet-era ruins surrounding them. But what disturbed him most was the faint sensation of something watching them. It was the same feeling they had experienced during their first days in Pripyat, the feeling of being observed by something just beyond the edge of their perception. A sudden noise echoed from the far end of the corridor, something shifting in the darkness. The sound was small, subtle, but enough to make their blood run cold. "We need to move," Eric whispered. "Now." Matt didn't hesitate. He turned toward the exit, but just as he did, the humming sound changed in pitch, rising to a sharp, almost mechanical whine. Then silence. The three of them stood frozen, listening, their hearts pounding. Stewie exhaled shakily. "I think we woke something up." Eric swallowed hard. "Then let's get out before it finds us." They moved quickly but cautiously, their steps barely making a sound as they navigated through the abandoned facility. The air inside felt heavier now, as if the very walls were closing in on them. Every shadow seemed to stretch unnaturally, and the deeper they went, the more the sensation of being watched intensified. As they reached the main entrance, Stewie hesitated. "Wait," he said. "What if we're walking right into whatever was making that sound?" "Then we don't stop moving," Matt replied. Eric took a deep breath and pushed the door open. The cold night air hit them like a wave, but something was wrong. The usual sounds of the wind rustling through the trees, the distant creaks of decaying buildings, everything was eerily silent. It was as if the entire exclusion zone was holding its breath. "We need to get back to the hotel," Eric said. "We regroup, think this through." No one argued. They slipped through the ruins of Pripyat as quickly as they could, keeping their flashlights low to avoid drawing attention. The sense of unease never left them, but no figures emerged from the darkness. No strange creatures lurked in their peripheral vision. Yet the feeling remained. Something had changed in Pripyat that night. Something had stirred. And they weren't sure if they had the courage to find out what it was. Back at their makeshift shelter in the abandoned hotel, Eric, Matt, and Stewie sat in silence, their minds still processing what had happened. The oppressive feeling that had followed them through the underground corridors had lessened, but it hadn't disappeared entirely. "That was different," Stewie finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "We've had weird stuff happen before, but that sound, those symbols, it was like something wanted us to find them. Or wanted to scare us away," Matt added, rubbing his temples. Eric stared out the broken window. The city was as lifeless as ever, but the silence felt unnatural now. He had spent years exploring abandoned places, but Pripyat was unlike anywhere else. It had its own presence, one that was watching them more closely than ever. "We leave tomorrow," Eric finally said. "We've pushed our luck enough. We get some rest, pack up at first light, and head back to the checkpoint." No one disagreed. The excitement of their adventure had turned into something more unnerving, something none of them could fully explain. Matt unrolled his sleeping bag near the door, keeping his backpack close. Stewie muttered something about keeping a flashlight within reach before settling down. Eric, however, struggled to relax. Even as exhaustion weighed down on him, his mind wouldn't let go of the unease. Every creak of the building, every gust of wind that whistled through the shattered windows, everything felt amplified, as if the city itself was restless. And then, just as he was about to drift into sleep, he heard it. A sound outside, faint, distant, but unmistakable. Footsteps, slow, deliberate footsteps on the pavement below. Eric's breath caught in his throat. He turned his head slightly, meeting Matt's wide-eyed gaze. He had heard it too. Without a word, Matt reached for his flashlight, but Eric shook his head. No lights. Not yet. The footsteps stopped. Silence. Then, a rustling sound, as if something was shifting through debris nearby. Stewie sat up abruptly. "Guys, shh," Eric whispered. The three of them remained frozen, listening. The noise didn't come closer, but it didn't go away either. Something or someone was out there. Minutes passed, stretching endlessly. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the sound stopped. Nothing. The city was silent again. Matt exhaled shakily. "It's probably just an animal," he murmured, though he didn't sound convinced. "Maybe," Eric said, but deep down, he wasn't sure at all. None of them slept well that night. As dawn broke over Pripyat, a pale, ghostly light filtered through the ruined buildings. Eric, Matt, and Stewie sat in silence, their backs against the crumbling hotel wall. None of them had slept well. The strange noises outside had left them on edge, and every shadow seemed to stretch just a little too long. Eric rubbed his face. "All right, we're leaving today. No more detours, no more exploring. We pack up, get to the edge of the city, and make it back to where we came in. Agreed?" Matt and Stewie nodded. They had all pushed their luck too far, and the weight of the past few days had finally caught up with them. They packed quickly, stuffing their gear into their backpacks and making sure they left no trace behind. As they stepped out into the empty streets, the morning air felt unnaturally still. No birds, no wind, just a heavy silence. Walking cautiously, they made their way through the deserted city, avoiding the open streets where any wandering patrols might spot them. Despite the eerie quiet, something about the atmosphere felt different. The presence they had felt before wasn't as strong. It was almost as if whatever had been watching them had retreated. "Maybe we imagined half of it," Stewie muttered, but even he didn't sound convinced. They moved through the cracked roads, past rusted-out vehicles and overgrown buildings. At one point, they passed the Ferris wheel again. The skeletal frame of the ride stood frozen in time, a haunting reminder of the city's past. Matt stopped for a moment, staring at it. "You know, as terrifying as this place is, it's kind of beautiful in its own way." Eric sighed. "Yeah, but it's time to go." They pressed on, reaching the outer edges of Pripyat. The exclusion zone's perimeter was still miles away, and they had a long trek ahead. As they slipped through a collapsed section of a fence, Eric took one last look at the city behind them. Pripyat stood still, silent, and unchanging. Whatever mysteries it held, they would remain buried. For now. The journey out of the exclusion zone was long and tense. Every snapped twig and distant rustle sent shivers down their spines. Though the overwhelming sense of being watched had faded, none of them felt truly safe until they were miles away from Pripyat. After hours of careful trekking, they finally reached the rendezvous point where their contact was waiting. A rusted van sat hidden behind a line of trees. Its driver, a quiet, middle-aged man with a thick beard, barely acknowledging them as they climbed inside. The van rumbled to life, and as they drove away, the ruined city disappeared behind the thick forest. The ride back was silent. None of them spoke about what they had seen, the things they had felt, or the shadows they had glimpsed in the night. It wasn't until they were back in the safety of their hotel room in Kiev that they finally exhaled. Matt collapsed onto the bed. "We actually did it. We survived Pripyat." Eric leaned against the window, staring at the city lights outside. "Barely." Stewie pulled out his camera, flipping through the photos they had taken. There were shots of rusted playgrounds, abandoned apartments, and long-forgotten Soviet murals. But as he scrolled, his face slowly paled. "Guys, look at this," he whispered. Eric and Matt leaned in. One of the pictures, taken near the hospital, showed a dark, humanoid figure standing in the background. It wasn't clear, almost like a smudge or distortion, but its shape was unmistakable. A chill ran through the room. None of them had seen it when they were there. Stewie shut off the camera. "Maybe, Maybe we don't talk about this to anyone. Eric and Matt nodded. Some things were better left behind. The next morning, they boarded a flight back to the United States. As the plane lifted into the sky, Eric looked out the window. In the distance, far below, the forests of the exclusion zone stretched endlessly. Somewhere within them, the ruins of Pripyat stood silent, waiting for the next group of explorers foolish enough to enter. And whatever lurked in the shadows would be waiting. The end. Subscribe to the channel if you want more stories.